Hello everyone, now we look at a very exciting game played between Anton Korobov and Leon-Luc Mendonca. It was played, of course, in the Challenger section of Tata Steel 2024. Perhaps I'll title this video that one should be very careful before being greedy, and you'll see why. It starts with e4 and e6, d4 and d5, the French, knight d2 and c5. We'll have the Tarrasch variation and the open variation in that. Knight G2f3, he takes d4 and knight takes d4. Knight f6 and e5, knight ft7 and knight 2 to f3. All standard opening development. Knight c6 and bishop f4, defending e5. Bishop e7 and bishop d3. g5, a very interesting way to play this. The center is closed, so of course we are permitted to launch a flank attack without worry. Bishop g3 and queen b6, putting pressure in the center. The only way to really play this is knight takes c6 and b takes c6 and h4. The best response here is actually to kick the knight away with g4. Knight to d2. Some central influence by white has been diminished, and then maybe knight c5. After white castles, you can grab that bishop, and we have achieved something. We have the bishop pair, but more importantly, that menacing light square bishop which white has in the French is gone. C takes e3 and a5, and the position is balanced, it will go on. But g takes h4 was played. This is not as precise. Bishop takes h4 and queen takes b2. Bishop e7 and king takes e7. A small price to pay actually. That dark square bishop for white was a bad bishop because there's a central pawn on e5 and all of the central pawns for black are on light squares. And consequently that dark square bishop for black was a good bishop. Rook b1 here, tempting black to play queen takes a2, and that's what black did. But this gives a lot of initiative to white. First you castle. Black's king is stuck in the center. You have castled safely. You have some good pieces. Black still has to develop that light square bishop, which is hemmed in by its own pawns, and the queen is a bit offside on a2. So queen a4 first. Queen d2. We'll go after the dark squares. Queen to g4, not allowing queen g5. Knight h2. Queen g7 and f4. Two advantages of knight h2. We can also push the f pawn, and that's exactly what Korobov does. Rook g8, creating some counterplay. Rook f2, a nice prophylactic move. The queen can now move freely without any threats of checkmate. And a5. You want to develop bishop a6 after this. c4. Challenging in the center. Bishop a6 and knight f3. Knight could come to d4, it could go to g5. All possible. And if we just think, how should black try to improve the position for himself? The king really has no place to go. Where should the rooks go? Let's consider a few alternatives here. There may be many ideas which come. Let's say something as simple as let's give up the bishop and exchange that light square bishop and play bishop into c4. But after bishop takes c4 and d takes c4, there's queen d6 check. This is what you allow. King e8 and f5. You're busting open the position and the king is stuck in the middle. Let's say e takes f5, and the point actually of f5 was that we don't even allow the queen to come to g6 to threaten that rook on b1, and we are not giving any counterplay. Objectively, we can grab that pawn on c6 immediately, but we play f5 first, force e takes f5, and then play queen takes c6, and we're threatening that rook, and we're not allowing any counterplay. Let's say rook d8 and e6 here. F takes, queen takes, king f8 and knight h4. We can see, and probably we don't even have to go any further, that black is not going to survive this attack. We can even see it a little if you want to get the queen out of the way. Rook takes f5, king e8 and queen takes g6. And yeah, black has really nothing here. Because after d takes c4 you allow queen d6. This is out of the question. If let's say you try to trade some rooks, rook a to b8 in that position, rook e1. we will push f5, and that's a common idea in many lines. And we've secured e5 one more time. That's a rook b6. We want to double up f5 anyway. Queen g4, not allowing f6 to come with a fork. So f6, king d8, and queen takes a5. Not a very good idea. If you try with the other rook, rook g to b8, again rook e1. And we'll see a similar pattern. Rook b6, for instance, to try to double up f5 anyway. The engine actually likes queen h6 here. For a moment, it stops f5. But we can capture in the center. And let's say c takes back, bishop takes a6, rook takes a6, and we have queen c1. And you see that we will infiltrate via the queen side and put a lot of pressure. The knight really has nowhere to go. The rook on a6 is offside. The queen on h6 is not very active. The king really is quite unsafe on e7. Luke played rook g to c8, preventing any threats to the c6 pawn with knight d4 ideas, but f5 anyway. g4. The strongest reply here is queen h6. We just wait before we capture, because we're also threatening f6 and then capturing on h7 and then going to h8. So black could be in a mating net. That's a threat. Something like, if you are not careful, you can play something like bishop takes c4. Then you can even capture on e6. That's also possible, and give up this bishop and take the knight. The queen would have to go back, but we have queen f6 check, forcing the king back. King e8, knight g5. There's a lot of pressure on black's position, and black will not survive this one. Queen h8, followed by rook into f7, deadly threats. So there's no time. You have to play something like rook g8 here. Just keep some pieces on the king side, and after f takes e6, queen takes e6, queen h4 check is possible. King f8 and knight d4 comes with tempo. We give up that e5 pawn, but we have queen h6 check to follow up. Rook to g7, because if the king moves, then rook e2 wins the queen. But knight e6 check, a very useful pin. Queen takes is also not possible, because we'll capture back with the queen and the f pawn would still be pinned. King g8, knight takes g7, queen takes g7, and queen takes c6. We are going to win more material, and of course this is completely winning. But after queen g4, slight difference in the move order. F takes e6 was played first, and f takes e6, and then queen h6 was played. And this is slightly different, but at the end it boils down to a very similar line. We have rook g8 still. Here, in the previous line, of course, we had forced that queen to move back, but here the f pawn has already moved. The queen is still on g4, so it's a bit different. But there's a very interesting move of knight d4. Essentially, we have opened the path of that rook on f2. Capturing the knight, of course, is not possible. Queen into h7 would be deadly. Rook ac8, for instance, and bishop f5. Very powerful stuff. The queen is threatened and e6 is overloaded. You have to capture, but then you allow queen d6 check. King to e8 and knight f5. We're threatening checkmate on g7, on e7, and rook g7 now to defend, but c takes d5. And in between move, we are preparing e6 amongst other things. The rook really has nowhere to go, so we will capture the rook later on. Bishop d3, for instance. Now we capture with check. Queen takes, and now queen e6 check. King d8 and rook f7. Black is gone. But after rook g8, bishop into h7 is played, and this is not as strong as knight d4. Simply rook g7 first. White is still doing very well, and you can again play knight d4 here. That's a rook h8 going after that bishop. Knight into c6 check. King to e8, bishop g6 check, and we'll grab that rook on h8. However, after rook g7, c into d5 was played. allowing rook to h2, rook h8, sorry. White can still do this, but you have to find d takes c6. You have to give up that bishop with tempo. And the point, it really is a beautiful line, is that after rook g into h7, the move you have to find, can you spot it? It's rook d2. And we say we'll give up the queen, but you will get checkmated in that line. So there is no time to grab on h6 because rook into d7, king e8 and rook b8 will lead to checkmate. So there is no time to actually grab the queen. That's what you have to spot. And so after this move, and you try to grab that the bishop, and you have rook to d2, you have to play something like knight e5 first, but then knight e5. Both queens are threatened, and also checkmate is threatened. If rook takes h6, then rook d7 check, king to f6 and knight g4 check. We'll pick up the rook, and of course there's already a pawn on c6, completely winning. So after rook h8, white is still winning, but you have to find d into c6 and then rook d2. Otherwise you'll lose the bishop for no good reason. But knight h2 was played, and this squanders the advantage. Perhaps Korobov missed this move, queen g3. This also puts pressure on that e-pawn, and that e-pawn is actually important because that in some lines is allowing a queen f6 or maybe a d6 push, but more importantly it hems that black king inside and the black king can't move. Queen e6 here is actually mandatory in order to get a draw, and that's the best white can hope for. A repetition, king d8, let's say. D takes c6 now. Rook g into h7 and c7 check. We want to open some lines towards the black king. King takes c7. Rook c2 check and king d8. Rook b8 check. Very interesting stuff. And the point is that if the knight captures, you have queen b6 check, and we will recover that knight. The king has to remain on the 8th rank, because if you come up, then rook c7 check followed by queen into b8 will be checkmate. So king e8 here, queen into b8 with check, king to e7, queen a7 let's say, king to e8. Again we go back, and the c8 square is covered. That's very important. Otherwise, of course, rook c8 would be checkmate, and again if we come up the board, then there would be a rook check on c6. So queen e8, king d7, and this kind of repetition would have to be done. That's the best you can hope for. But after queen g3, rook b3 was played, trying to deflect that queen from g3, but simply queen into e5. And now we see that black's counter attack is now ready. White will lose material here. So d6 was played, but it doesn't achieve too much. King d8 simply. Queen h4 check, king c8, knight f3, but queen d5. You will lose that bishop on h7 eventually, and of course, while you save the bishop on the rook on b3, you will lose that bishop on h7 and ultimately the game. And this is where Anton Korobov resigned after playing a very beautiful attacking game, but at the end he couldn't convert it. And a nice victory for Leon Luke Mendonca. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.